And I think it'd be healthy, honestly, to go to lunch sometime and just let it all, it's like poking a boil, so to speak. It's like you just got to get it out. I'm not sure if we're supposed to do that here, right? So that's the question. It's like, because we need to get it out, right? So for those of you who are going to leave in a little bit, hopefully you'll wait. Don't walk out. We're going to get over into this space. We're going to land there, okay? So the lectionary gave us John 18, okay, which is right here. And I got to thinking how irrelevant that might be, to talk about that in light of what happened in November, just a few weeks ago. So I've been kind of troubled, very troubled actually, spending a lot of time at the coffee store and obviously spending time with my buddy Kenton, and we've been talking a little bit about philosophers. And so I'm a novice, very much, so I'm very much of an early student in trying to understand philosophy and kind of what that means. So that's kind of why I picked up a book. I ordered the thinnest book. And I told Rod it's taking me a week to get through 9 pages. So that kind of tells you the density of it. So what I did come up with though is that, this is kind of it's a little bit about me, and that is this is the way my brain works. It's exact. If you wanted to know, if you did a biopsy, I said this is how Jim's brain works. And it comes up. I did this. These lines came into my mind, and then I came up with this right here. The zone of potential perspective. And I realized, and this was the first thing that came to me when I was thinking about John 18. I could interpret John 18 from this limited perspective of what I saw and what the political environment is and Christian nationalism. We could throw a lot of terms out, right? And we could all talk today and tomorrow, the next day, about John 18 with the limited perspective of 2024. Or we could open the aperture. Now, some of us, me included, find that kind of tedious and troubling. It's like math. It's like, oh gosh, right? I mean, it just beats you down to think because of this, I've got to think like this. That's a lot of work. And I'm just kind of tired. I'm 67, I turned 67 this week. So I'm tired, maybe, or I'm bored, or I'm distracted. I've got a new grandson. I've got other things going on in my life I'd rather spend time thinking about than opening the aperture to understand what the heck is going on here and how this is relevant. Because that's what we're here to find out. So that's where St. Augustine came in. I was like, oh my gosh, now it starts to make a little sense. So I want to kind of spend some time there, and I'm going to put a few marks on the board to kind of, they're not entirely accurate, but they're going to get you in the ball game. This period of time here is kind of the Genesis timeline of the Bible right here, and kind of Abraham shows up on the scene right around 1900 BCE, something like that. All right, here I write that down because what I found was fascinating is about 400 years before Christ was born, you get Plato show up in the Western Civ, and about 400 years after Christ is born, St. Augustine shows up. Two big kind of Western philosophers. And St. Augustine kind of becomes like this, as I've discovered, like this rock, like this, it's a boulder actually, in the middle of Christendom, right? In the middle of the beginning of the early church. St. Augustine really starts to show up as a thinker. And you gotta go, well, why is he so important? What was he saying that got him into the position this early in the church's history? Now, what's fascinating is I went back and looked at a little history of St. Augustine and found out that he was raised in a kind of a rural area of Algeria. And he was a Roman. So his mama was Roman, daddy was Roman. And they were Romans in Algeria. Okay, part of the Roman occupation. Okay, and his mama was Saint Monica. So his mama taught him Christianity. That's kind of cool. His mama had to deal with a bad daddy, baby daddy. Okay, adulterer, didn't pay attention. So mama really was kind of the early driver of his knowledge. Now he was not a great dude. That is, he came into faith, like many of us, and I can identify with him. Someone who had a really difficult, even though mama tried, he kind of went about his business. Ultimately, he's a very smart guy, and so he becomes pretty successful. And by age 40, he's gone from, I'm a bad guy, to writing books about Christianity. And that lasts forever, like predicting. St. Augustine seems to predict what Darwin actually proves, that evolution, that the mind is evolving, that our brain's evolving, and that we have to interpret this, and this, and this, and this, through the evolution of our own minds, our own hearts. And what he introduced, what was so cool, was this idea that God had access to absolute truth. That God was absolute truth, and that we could access that. We, in the way our minds are built, can access. We have a part of our mind, our brain, up here, that can connect to, draw in, and hold ideas that are of God, and combine them with what we're seeing, what we're seeing in the here and now, to help us interpret what we think is going on. So that's his big to me. That's his big contribution, and he's saying it at a time when there's just really very little science, right? So he has no neurobiological science like we have. Okay, so let's do this. What I thought was fascinating is if you think about these two lines here, the history of the Jews, and there's something going on with God. We all know this, right? We all know this. Something's going on with God talking to the world, humanity, through this group of people. And we study that kind of like the Old Testament. And in fact, Brad told about last week, the Old Testament had something unique about it, which was this covenant thing, right? Now, do we buy that? That's the question that kind of came into my mind is, do we really buy that? Is that how God really did it? What do y'all think? Did he really intend for this group of people to introduce to the planet transcendent truth through the Jews? I don't know.
I buy that.
You do.
I'm a buyer.
I do. And part of that whole dynamism was this substitutionary atonement thing. Like, hey, y'all are going to sin. Bring some of these birds and other stuff and kill them on this altar, and all that kind of ritual, mechanical stuff. You remember how the calendar is structured? They had a calendar every 12 months. They did the same thing over and over again. We talked a little bit about, like, guess what? That has a timeline on it, doesn't it? What we heard from Brad is like, that kind of ends at some point. And it's fascinating. John 18 gets you close to that moment. We're like, it's over. All right, so that's what's cool about John 18, I think, is like it starts you, it brings us into this this moment where this history, all this behavior about how we interact with truth, with absolute truth, is through behaviors of ritual of some sort. That's what it seems to me. Now, I want to kind of dynamic here is, so what's interesting here, that these two folks start getting together, right? So the intersection between Western civilization and the Jewish nation start to get together when the Romans take over Judea, right? And they occupy not only Judea, but a big part of the world for quite a long time. And in fact, they would still be occupying if the Ottomans didn't push them out. Right? So this goes for quite a long time. You know, let's put it out here somewhere. Where the Roman Empire, right, and the intersection between the Jews, where God had started, obviously the Abrahamic covenant actually starts to occur because the message of God actually pops through the Jewish people into the non-Jewish people, and the point of it is right there. And in fact, it's so significant that we mark our calendar that way. That's what's so bizarre, is that we actually say that's really important, and the rest of the world goes along with it.
We think the rest of the world goes along with it.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I'm talking about a calendar. Don't we say, we all kind of mark, generally, the world marks January 1st as the new year, almost all.
Jews still celebrate their New Year, Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
By their
I'm talking about the calendar, like
I know, but
January 2nd.
But they have their calendar.
Okay,
So.
all right, very good. Very good. All right. All right, good point. All right, so what we want to talk about then is, how does John 18 remind you of 2024? All right, let's look at it. Anybody have it? I think it's about,
Which verses?
yeah, let's pick up around verse 20.
Jesus answered, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said. When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered, If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. How far off?
All right, that's fine. You got the general gist. It's such a common story. And I got to thinking, there's a lot of theologians in the room, and there's a lot of themes that you can teach on with regards to John 18. But what I thought it would be important is to kind of, if you will, lift. I'm going to try to do this very gently. Lift the scab off just a little bit. Okay, it probably is too early, actually. There's no scabbing yet.
No, it's scary.
There's no scabbing. And I think Bill said this really well, and that is, when you talk about schools in Texas, right? What does that represent? What is this? Let's just use that as a symbol, really, because there's plenty of examples, and we all have our hot spots, right, around different things that are going on. Christian nationalism is kind of another thing here that goes here. What else do you have?
Which is tied into what's going on with schools in Texas. It's very much empire.
Thank you. That's a great word. Thank you. Empire.
It's all about the patriarchy.
Ooh, just going deep there, right? So we're going to put patriarchy up here.
I don't know if this is what you're asking, but schools used to be a source of community. and now they're a source of division and dislike and
Okay.
vitriol.
Okay. All right.
They're a tool.
Being used as a tool, right?
Definitely.
Okay. All right. Anything else that just jumps out off the page for y'all? Patriarchy, control of.
How we think they want.
Okay.
Everybody to feel the same like mind.
All right.
Fear. That's a good one.
All right. Good.
There's also greed involved in this because it's
Greed.
greedy people who want to make a profit off of our school children, so they're trying to destroy the
Okay.
public schools,
Got it.
private schools.
Yeah. So that gets us in the ballpark of kind of the, why we're all taking Nexium. Right, or Xanax, or gummies. Pick your drug, right? I like bourbon and gummies. All right, seriously, guys. All right, so what do you get here? What did you get out of John 18? What was going on? What labels would you attach to that window of time?
Scapegoat.
Because this is Sunday school, huh?
Scapegoat.
Scapegoating, okay.
Well, it was a time of empire too.
Yeah, it's all the
Yes.
same.
Oh, looky here. In fact, if it wasn't for the darn Ottomans, they'd still be running the place, right? Oh, guess what they did when the Ottomans came? They just turned west. 1619, you might think about that for a minute. Right, they took black people from Africa and sent them over to chop cotton, right? So you see where this thing, greed, that to me really jumped out this last few weeks. Is that how you spell that, greed? Sure. Okay. Now, is there any greed going on in the story of John 18? What do we see? What do we see inside the actual narrative? Now, I got into this, I got down into the weeds, and I found out that, John, the guy, didn't actually write the book. That scared me. Because I'd been thinking for about 4 weeks that he did. All right. So then I realized, it was put together. But what I came to terms with is these were witnesses. That you couldn't have written this without being witnessed. And it was told, right? So witnesses told the story, maybe. And then it got put together. And there's some theory that it got written around 90 AD. Let's call it that, right? So let's mark it here. Somewhere, and it's the West that writes it. So let's put it right about here. Okay, so it gets put together, and there's other books. John, by the way, becomes a writer, something I'm trying to learn to do. He's not like Matthew. I think Matthew may have only written, but John's trying to become a writer. He writes John 1, 2, 3, and Revelations. Or is that a group of people? I don't know. I mean, there's the theologians in the room who can figure that, can tell me. But this idea that all this canon gets written about this story that starts right here that we mark our calendars with. All right? Because it's a significant thing. What is significant about it? What else is going on in John 18 that makes this so darn significant? That's what came to my mind.
Are you talking about how Jesus is trying to bring a new way against empire?
Okay. Tell me more.
Well, love and forgiveness doesn't really go well with greed.
Uh-huh.
Second chances doesn't go well with greed.
So there's a spot in John 18 where Jesus' response is like, my followers aren't trying to force you to release me, right? So there's this idea that, going to your point, that Jesus has something in his mind, maybe, or that this is the story that's being told, that something's going on with this guy who's tied up, standing in front of Caiaphas and Pontius Pilate. And he kind of acts kind of strange because he might be on trial for his life. That's the theory that's going on here, right? And he doesn't, all of his followers don't come and get him. There's no big insurrection. Right? Nobody shows up. In fact, Peter hangs out outside. He said, I'm not going in. I want to stay clean. You know, there's a whole bunch of people going, all the Jews kind of like, hey, Passover's coming, we got to stay clean. Right? Because they were in the ritual. They were in that kind of calendar ritual stuff. So I think you're right, Annette. I think there's something unique about that behavior. That's what I think. I've heard sermons about the behavior. And I think that it could be that that's important. I'm just not.
They see him as a threat.
A threat.
To their empire, to their kingdom. And then he says, my kingdom's not of this world, and they don't know what to do with that at that point. Because he's saying, I'm not trying to take political power from you.
In fact, he says something really pretty dramatic. He says, my kingdom is really, and this is what Pontius Pilate kind of like, I don't know what to do with this. My thing's about truth, right? Hey, and he goes, well, who can know the truth? Right? Augustine picks up on that. Now this is what's kind of cool. This is what I found. Now here's this book. Okay, this thing gets written. Okay, but about 300 AD, 200 more years. Let's go here. By the way, during this period of time, 100 years to 300 years, when Roman Empire is expanding, and it's going around the Mediterranean, and it's picking up all these port cities all across, for greed, for trade, for power, for empire.
Yeah.
So that's the operations, and they're carrying forward this perspective, political, economic power. That's the modus operandi. And then Constantine gets a great idea. Let's go, hey, let's loop in this Christianity thing. Let's do a deal. Uh-oh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, it just jumped off the page at me. Like, oh my gosh. Right there. Now, Augustine is born 350. Okay? He writes his first book in 400. He was born 46 years later. He's born in 354. He writes his first book in 46 years later. And his philosophy talks about this idea of being able to grasp, humans can grasp eternal truth. That's one part of your mind. Your other part of your mind is the part that just is watching me right now. And saying, oh, his hair looks this and his beard looks that. And, blah, blah, blah. He's talking and I hear what he's saying and you see it, you sense it with your eyes and your ears. You can't touch me. You can't smell me. Oh, you can't taste me. So you're using your eyes and you're using two senses. And with those two senses, you are internalizing information through pathways, through vibratory pathways, right? Particle paths, subatomic stuff. And you're cataloging it in your head, in your brain. And the only reason why it's working is because you're breathing. If you stop, if I stop you breathing, this stuff will stop working. Okay? All right. But what's so fascinating about that is that the sense that you're taking in my words, you already have another part of your brain that's judging what my words meant. The word I used. Augustine talked about this in 400, this blows your mind. It just blows your mind that this guy's actually writing these ideas down. All right, so he has those two perspectives, and he says, but the third perspective, mind number 3, that sits up here in this squash, is that you can grab a hold of and connect to eternal truth. Okay? Now, my hunch is, raised by his mother, he lived in Algeria, that was the Romans had occupied. He's a Roman in a place, right, that probably the neighbors didn't think, maybe he just had a hard time in elementary school, I don't know. You know, but they were wealthy maybe, and he was well educated. So he's clearly of the dominant class, but his dad was not a great guy, and he became not such a great guy. But ultimately, his mother's influence won out. But Augustine had to see this. He had to have seen this empire and greed concept as he formulated his perspective and integrated. He was the first philosopher that integrated the ability that we are connected to God, and God is separate from us. And that the Christian idea of what John 18 is talking about, my kingdom is truth, not greed, control, patriarchy, all that stuff. All right.
Jim,
Yeah.
it's also interesting that Constantine told the big lie. So Constantine's story was, I saw a vision of a cross in the distance when I was going to war. And if I win, then I will have everyone baptized. To the point that he cut people's heads off if they didn't agree.
Okay. Good ad.
Which ties into, and John Crossman argues that it's at that moment Constantine's rule when Christianity got sold out.
Yeah.
297.
So there's a little piece of history here.
Sorry, what year was that?
297, if I recall.
Yeah. So Constantine puts together the canon that we now call the Bible. He puts it together. I agree. Here, see, now I got my feelings.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
he was ruling at the time it was put
Okay,
together.
fair enough. So there's this idea that there's a government Christianity thing. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't want to offend you guys. Did you know where we are? What I'm trying to tell you is that this is not any different than what's been going on for a long time. And the question is what is your frickin' eternal truth? He's saying, yes, you can see it. It's right in front of you. But I think there's this idea that you have to go below the surface and figure out whether or not you buy this. Which is, what is that story about? Which is the thing that you've been driving me crazy about. The thing you said, this voluntary, sacrificial love.
So Jim, in John 18, before the verses that we just read, Jesus takes the sword out of the hand of Peter. Okay, so when that happens, and Jesus says, you don't get to do that. This is not an option for
Nice.
you. When you set up the idea of, well, his followers aren't coming to get him. Well, they don't get to bring a sword
Right.
to come get him, okay? So this is in the John 18 construct, you have Jesus essentially saying, I am who I say I am. Talk to other people, they'll tell you what I said, I'm good with it. So he's staking out I will rely on other people hearing what I said to identify me. And then, Peter's denials are all built up after the sword's taken out of his hand. So Peter's having to come to grips, my view, Peter's having to come to grips with having to serve a master who will not allow him to shed blood to get a kingdom. Okay? That's our Christianity, which most of us were never taught. I had this conversation with my sister yesterday.
Yeah.
And when we get to Constantine, this idea of us being nonviolent, us being people who would not pick up a sword
Right.
to grow the kingdom of God went away. That's what happened. And our history for the first 300 years was a history where you would not roll out and say, you know what I just did? I went and, joined the army. They'd be going, what? No, we're Christians. We don't do that. That's not our game. It's the idea of we were Quakers. We were, you can get an equivalent in America of people who took this vow of, nah, we read scripture and we don't read it that way. But once you do that, you cannot be aligned with the kingdom, a worldly kingdom. You just can't, because our kingdoms are built with power and violence. And, fast forward to 2024, where we are, and everything up there is true, what's circling 2024, but the real Christian response to all that has to be to respond to it. And I deeply struggle with this, to respond to it in a way that does not allow the sword. You don't get a sword. And,
Yeah, I would add
if you rolled through churches in Texas right now and said, here's the deal, Jesus wants all your guns up at the altar, we're taking them away, they would go nuts, right? They'd just go, no, that can't be Jesus, that's gotta be the devil, right?
Right.
And it would be completely opposite to what they know and understand Jesus to be, but that's because they're only getting back to Constantine.
Well, Al,
They're not getting previous to
The response of some of them to preachers preaching a Sermon on the Mount is, it's not that, well, that couldn't be Jesus. No, it is, well, that's too weak. Jesus was too weak here. Jesus is subversive.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
they're denying Jesus. They're going through the same struggle that Peter would. I've never heard that connected, that Jesus telling him to put away the sword, and then his
denial.
And that is fascinating. I had not thought about that. That leads to doubt on his part of the
Say it
question.
again. It's the myth of redemptive violence.
Huh?
It's the myth of redemptive violence.
Yeah.
That's kind of the fancy phrase for what he's talking about. Either you have to either reject it or embrace it.
I think I'm just echoing Al, but anytime you mix try to mix empire and religion, one becomes a servant of the other, and it's always empire that's in charge.
Okay.
Cannot serve two masters.
So let me land the plane. So we know, we can, you are just describing what you see. You're functioning with your mind, your sensory. I'm challenging this group at this moment. We can all do that. I think the next generation and the generation after that, our children and our grandchildren, require more. They require us to see with that third mind. And that's voluntary sacrificial love. If we can put aside the compulsion almost to talk about this stuff without talking about eternal truth. So what is eternal truth? How do you discover it? Can you really get there? Have you been there ever? How do you do that? I do that when I listen to the choir sometimes. That's what's so neat about what we said a while ago. But you get in touch with God through some other way than just with your eyes and your ears. There's something else there. That's what St. Augustine is saying. Now, this is on our watch. This was going on his watch. Okay? My hunch is that there's a lot of similarities, and it may go the same way. Somebody said empire. Well, the empire lasted quite a while. They seem to do very well with that stuff. especially if people don't pick up swords, right, against them. Eventually, some other force comes and gets them. But my thinking is, while we're on the planet, which we only have about 20, 30 years left, we might want to use that third mind and see if we can influence our grandchildren or our children in some transcendent, eternal truth that's baked in. Now, the trial, interestingly, the trial precedes the cross, which precedes resurrection. Now, what's interesting, these people in this period of time already know the resurrection happened. So, fast forward from John 18 into this window of time, the conversation that then gets crafted in the canon is that there is eternal life. That in fact, the kingdom that is true is eternal. And so it transcends what we're seeing, what we see. And we can live in that space too. Not to be monks, but rather to be people of hope. To see that there is some type of eternal idea. So I think in the thing that we're facing as it's significant. I mean, there's no question, it's significant. And we can go and unpack how we got here. My son from New York came in yesterday and he says, Dad, he's 32 or 3. He said, Dad, I think your generation flogs yourself a lot about how we got here. As if we're responsible, as if we're guilty for climate change or for the schools getting taken over by the government or the churches. He said, I think there's other forces out there that are not inside your control, so you need to kind of let yourself up. He says, and then we got to talking about some of his generation, y'all probably aware of this, have decided not to have kids. So, and there's going to be a lot of grandparents a lot of people our age without grandkids. So, my point is that speaks to this idea that we have still work to do. We still have a responsibility in this kind of last part of our life. And I'm not sure having a more refined discussion about what we're observing is really it. I don't think that's what Sunday school's for. So I think it's kind of like, maybe we need to dig deeper and go dark for a little bit and study and see what God's eternal truth is and communicate that a little bit. I'll let you go now. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jim. Very provocative. Yep.